Alfred. The next morning, after collecting supplies for his journey, the traveller followed a lane north. Small cottages and a brook bordered the lane. Large paving stones leading to garden gates crossed the stone-lined ditch. In the last of the gardens, the traveller saw the same unkempt man he had seen in the marketplace early in his time in Riverton. The garden reflected his appearance. The man looked up. He was old, but he carried his spade with ease. The man saw the traveller coming and called out, "Any friend of Sarah's is a friend of mine." He spoke with a confident, friendly tone and approached the low wall. His hand extended. "Forgive me, my name is Alfred. I saw you with Sarah in the square and asked after you. She said you were a friend from long ago." "A friend of the family," the traveller said as he took Alfred's hand. The traveller looked into the garden. Alfred said, "I once had it looking a bit more like the others." The traveller replied, "It seems a fitting expression." Alfred laughed. "That is probably true. I am what I am, and so is my garden." "You said it once looked more like the others." "I grew up among businessmen and bankers. That was my world, but I didn't belong, so I left." "How can you not belong in your own world?" "I don't know. I grew up in the same environment as my contemporaries, but then found myself out of step with them. All around me, friends and family pursued their various paths within that world. I tried, but I could never find the passion for it others seemed to have. I was born into it, but in the end I never really felt a part of it." "But why not?" "I think there was a conflict between what I expected of myself as a man within society and what I expected of myself as an individual." "Why would those be different?" Alfred considered for a moment before answering. In the silence, the brook trickled by. Birds shuffled in the hedges and called from the trees. When a man's experience is imprinted with certain expectations, they become part of the fabric of his thinking. But I had something else in me as well, a sense of myself outside that world. I was neither able to sacrifice myself nor my society. I didn't mind compromising. I would have been happy to have carried both at once, but the two never proved to be compatible. The terms were never acceptable. The choice always seemed to be myself or society. "And so you chose yourself?" "Ultimately, yes, because at least I can know myself. I can control my choices and bear the weight of them. But society is jealous, and in the end it is single-minded. It was hard to watch the divergence, as those I had known all my life moved along the paths they had chosen, and I along mine. I became removed and isolated. I, rather too literally, fell by the wayside. For a time, certain ties held, but even with those, as the years passed, I realized the sheer difference between myself and even those who had been closest. To meet them, it became necessary to bridge a gap, to reflect deeper to a time and a reality that no longer existed, that was so far in the past it had become almost irrelevant. They were no longer who I would choose, and if I'm honest, which I try to be, I was no longer who they would choose either. Eventually, they too turned their backs or caused me to turn mine. People develop according to the steps they tread, and my steps were very different from those of my peers. Shared experience is everything. Unavoidably, my sense of individualism that I had relied on so heavily started to suffer. "Why would that suffer?" the traveller asked. "Like all men, I have a social instinct that draws me to others. It was that social instinct that questioned my individuality and attempted to undermine it." "I am not sure I follow," the traveller said. "I am saying that, within myself, I suffered the same battle that I fought with the world around me. I knew that a part of me would not allow me to survive without others, but I also knew that I could not survive with others so long as to do so would require the sacrifice of myself. I tried to hide the conflict, so as to be more amenable, and I offered what I was comfortable offering, and I tried to hide what I could not offer, so as to fool people into thinking that I gave them everything. I strengthened myself until my abilities in relevant areas were significant. I hoped those abilities would be so sufficient for society not to think to ask for more. But the conflict could be seen in my eyes. I could never pretend for long. Even where I was able to convince for a time, others eventually sensed where I stood, even if it was just that I was different, something foreign, therefore untrustworthy. It is one thing for people not to be wary of a stranger. But is it not another step to be considered untrustworthy? The traveller asked. What I mean is I had reserved something for myself, whereas they had not. They did not have that second person within them, that second life, a genuinely substantial other world. The most they had was a family, perhaps an interest or two. Their life was what they gave, and they knew nothing more, or at least thought of little else. In fact, it is considered a matter of basic practical wisdom to focus only on that which is before you. I was also focusing on that which was before me, but that which was before me included an entire array of internal experience, a living world of creation and destruction with associated deliberation of intellect and emotion. I could not switch it off. It was there, and in fact I had rejected the idea that it should be shunned. It was precisely the influence of that world that I had in my life found most genuine, most true. This would not be the case if it were used differently. The point was to use it deliberately, with purpose, and for a cause. It was to comprehend that which would be better. But looking to see and achieve what was better was precisely what pushed me apart. So you see, within myself I was tortured with a bifurcation of interest, and among my own people I was tortured because I had traveled too far down that path to return. I was never comfortable anywhere. The traveler said, "Yet you speak of it with ease." Alfred stepped forward and turned to lean against the wall. He looked at his house. "That is not to say it was not difficult. We are taught, perhaps above all, to value the company of others. We realize it was only together that we survived. Somewhere within us we hold on to this as though our lives still depend on it, and of course to some extent they do. We cannot each do all that needs to be done. However, that being said, we can do more than most people realize. We rely, in my view, far too much on one another." "Is it not mutual reliance that prevents conflict?" the traveler asked. Alfred laughed. "If that is what it takes to keep men from fighting, we should be sorry. And what conflict is avoided? I have seen mutual reliance. I grew up in it, just like everyone else. Conflict comes in many forms, and often the most overt is the least cruel. The slow starving of people seems far crueler than a quick death." Alfred crossed his arms. "Anyway, in my case it wasn't a choice. I had to learn to rely on myself. I didn't have the luxury of relying on others. The world of mutual reliance had inadvertently shut me out. I had to learn to exist alone in a world that operates by group endeavor." He turned to face the traveler. "It's not easy to compete singularly in an environment made up of groups. It's not easy to carve a space, not easy to be trusted. Why would anyone trust someone that is alone? Why would someone be alone if not because they had already lost the trust of others? And what better way to lose trust than to give up the company of those who have never known what it is to rely solely and fully on themselves alone, and who require the reassurance of others regardless of whether all around them are wrong? I can see the benefits of mutual reliance easily enough. I understand that where different members of a group are set to different tasks, more may be accomplished, and that people in that world may have a greater opportunity to develop, and that man as a whole can be more effective in that way, more efficient. But society's effectiveness, it seems to me, is precisely where its problem lies. Mutual reliance brings about mutual assurance, and mutual assurance generally comes at the expense of truth, at the expense of individual or even group integrity. I preferred my personal integrity, or at least what I understood that to be, and I preferred it even with its clear faults. At least that way they were in the open, and I could take responsibility for them." The traveler asked, "If it was not on the same models as your contemporaries, on what did you base your idea of personal integrity?" "I based it on that side of life that seemed most real, most important, to me, even if not to others, even if against some or many of their customs. I'm not against customs as such, but customs are not always ideal or even beneficial. But their power can remain long after their usefulness has faded, and when that happens, the wrongs they create are not only perpetuated, but magnified along with the increasing reach of man. Wars become worse, poverty becomes worse, the corruption, the distortion, stifles a positive development of the mind." Alfred continued in easier tones, though still with intensity. "I have long believed that, once man had achieved his comfort within nature, his priority should have been shifted back to himself." "Has man not always focused on himself?" "Not in the way I am talking about. He focuses on himself, but in the wrong way. He outsources his soul." "What do you mean?" "That's the downside to mutual reliance that I was talking about before. People have become so expert in division of labor that they outsource their connection to a soul. They give up their soul for something outside, a pre-packaged soul that they can access for a fee. Sorry, I'm being flippant. I'm saying that only by himself can a man truly mature and evolve, only by testing himself against the reality of his soul. I mean the soul that is visible only when he is alone with himself and his true nature. It is too easy to ignore simple truths when others ignore them too, and everyone can pretend they don't exist together. What good does it do a man to look for reassuring guidance from a culture steeped to its core in grandiosity and self-importance? That is what the world I lived in was like. The worst of us, though I could say the best of us, in the sense that they were the most highly regarded and successful, were constantly maneuvering through social or business dealings with lies and deceptions through the cheating of others. The best at it were invariably the most admired. They were rewarded for precisely those traits for which they should have been shunned. They were compensated with resources and position, and they reveled in their cleverness and turned a blind eye to the ruin they caused. Man looks for so much security in his fellows that it allows the entire group to lose its way. The influx of attention makes the entire group drunk with confidence, enough to counter the lack of confidence it feels, and the individual standing alone before his true conscience can say or do nothing against it. The traveller pressed him. Is there not also risk in individuality? Certainly. Men in company can support each other when weak, whereas a man alone must rely on himself. Men keep each other in check, but they rely too much on others for that and too little on their own dignity. When one man goes astray, he pays. When all go astray, there is no check. Each person thinks himself right because he has forgotten his true measure, having displaced it for the measure of his equally misguided fellows. That being said, while I may not keep the company I once kept, I didn't completely cut myself off. Ironically, perhaps, I keep in touch by serving others. My desire to serve is precisely what kept me alive these many years. You could not rely on your fellows, but you still wish to serve them? No, I needed people. A part of me still needed to be in touch. I couldn't be completely alone. I see, said the traveller, but he waited for more. In the early years, it was difficult. I was young. I hadn't gained the confidence I have now. My service started in those years. My own survival was at stake. I had become foreign to myself as well as to others. It seemed to me that I had no place, that I had been misplaced. How else could I seem so different in ways that seemed so fundamental? What caused you to leave? A woman's family. Tell me about her, said the traveller. Her name was Ethel. She was from an old family, and not just old, but wealthy. My family was wealthy too, through generations of trade, but where the old families have retained their wealth, they avoid mixing with families like mine. Ethel had grown up on her family's estate. She had been educated in the ways of her society. Tutors taught her languages. Her governesses taught her to be like her mother, but her spirit was livelier than could be allowed. I was unlike the other men to whom she had been introduced, and we ignored the lack of possibility that her family could ever be convinced to accept me. Another man would have realized the futility and stepped aside. I didn't. Alfred brushed his fingers back and forth over the wall. Their estate was large, with woods and hills. It was easy enough for me to ride to meet her. We probably knew it could not last. It was her mother's maid that exposed us. I was summoned. Her mother, a formidable woman, threatened me with ruin. That meant relatively little to me, but they were powerful in a way that could affect my family. She made it clear that my actions would have direct consequences beyond my own immediate interests. To this day, I remain intrigued by the layers of power that exist. My family controlled men. Our sway reached even beyond the shores of the country, and yet I knew as well as she that we could be ostracized, our business holdings ruined, by mere words from this woman and her husband in their circles. I had walked away from the business my family conducted, but I could not allow my selfishness to reach so far as to threaten it. Alfred smiled, not out of any pleasure, but rather in reflection of the irony of power. The repercussions did not in the end stretch to my family, but I did suffer from that woman's wrath. After that talk with Ethel's mother, I found a coldness entered my world. She had made her will known. Ethel was restricted to the house. She no longer came to town. No one saw her for months. Alfred thought for a moment about what he had said. After that, there was no place for me. Already I existed on the outskirts, but after that I was simply not welcome. That was her power, and the susceptibility of that entire society to her will. Could her influence really go so far? Asked the traveller. Yes, it could. You have to understand, No matter how rich my peers became, they always sought to indulge that ever higher echelon of power, even if it meant turning on one of their own. And there was no chance of anything coming from their indulgence of her will. Her kind would never accept any of us into their ranks. Well, it has happened, to some extent I suppose. But no, generally they protected their position from those below just as we protected ours. That is the nature of power. It must always be protected, and the more power gained, the more jealously it must be guarded. A light breeze picked up from the valley floor. The traveler spoke slowly. So, by pursuing love you lost both your love and your friends? Alfred nodded. Even the closest and oldest of my friends turned their backs on me. I felt like a coward for running away. Perhaps I should have gone there and taken her away. But where would that have left us? We would have been ostracized. But then we were ostracized anyway. What difference would it have made? Perhaps none. No, I had already ruined her life and mine. It was enough. By doing what seemed to be the right thing, I had lost everything. It doesn't sound like much now, from your perspective perhaps, but they were dark times. It was not easy for me to walk away. It has never been easy for me to walk away from something I considered true and pure. It just became such a mess, and then my entire world sort of crumbled around me. That is to say, it rejected me. Only a deep instinct kept me alive in that time, and it did so by tricking me. It led me to make small contracts with life. So long as a contract existed, I could not quite leave. Alfred rested his elbows on the wall in thought, and looked up and down the lane at the neighbouring cottages. You remember I said I always sought to serve? The traveller nodded. Well, the service came in the form of promises. I came from a family of merchants and bankers. I was steeped in the duties of contracts. Even in my worst days I made promises, and others relied on those promises, or I imagined they did. The duty was to the contract. While reliance remained, I had to remain, and I never allowed those duties to cease. Was that all that kept you alive? The traveller asked. It was a mechanism at least. I rarely hold to common notions of things. I'm not a religious man. The idea that from this life I shall jump to a state of heaven or to a state of hell seems ridiculous to me. What is life other than some sort of purgatory? We all know pleasures and pain here. The traveller was silent. He waited and listened. Alfred continued. Why should I suffer just because someone else will suffer if my life ends? In such a case, should they not suffer more while I live if they love me? Should the deluded beliefs of others mean that I must live with pain? Why? Why are we so capable at finding ways to cause and perpetuate pain in others? So what else could it be that kept me alive if it was not some notion of right or wrong, nor even the feelings of others? I will tell you, it was something else, that same survival instinct that caused an animal to turn vicious when cornered. I owed it to all of those who had thought it worth knowing me, that my life, my approach, did not prove to have been meaningless in the end. You attempted to prove relevant the very same life that you yourself had deemed misplaced? I figured I might as well try, and I couldn't help myself. I was genuinely curious. Why should I be here? One way or another, everything that exists, exists. Why should I accept, on the basis of the opinion of those with whom I specifically disagreed, that what I understand to be true and worthwhile is wrong? There is a reason I didn't accept the ways I left behind. I didn't accept them because I thought them foolish. Should I allow my own beliefs to be deemed worthless on the basis of the very opinion that I had rejected? I don't think so. But then I am set in my ways, and perhaps I have been wrong all along. And yet I am not uneducated. I have fed my mind just as much as, if not more than practically all of those I disagreed with. For that reason, and because I have always deemed myself to be as capable as any, I shall remain true to myself. I do not believe in following without question the ways of others, no matter how many of them agree on whatever it is. But there we are. You can see that I also have the survival instinct. Unlike anyone else, my esteem for myself feeds that instinct. Perhaps I am not so different from others after all. You are right, though. There was something more. The reliance of others on me would not have been enough on its own. No, the contract that kept me alive was with myself. It was to survive, but to survive without merely surviving. Again, Alfred smiled and looked at his wild garden. To me, humanity is something to be nurtured and matured. It was for that we survived. Our greatest teacher, in my view, is the wild elegance in nature, and not in repressed nature. Your friend Sarah understands that as well as anyone. She is really a perfect personification of what inspires me. What I mean to say is she personifies wild nature, but with the kindness of humanity. She is old now. She did not allow her true nature to be suppressed. The traveller knew Sarah's life as a life full of suppression of concerns about her husband, her son, and the response of her fellow villagers to her daughter. But not to discard Alfred's comment, the traveller considered there to be another side to her that had developed in these late days of her life. Alfred continued, "True humanity does not come from removal from nature, nor through the domination of nature. It comes when a man marries his body to his soul. But such a person is rare. I see only the continuation of dominance in our future. That is what people teach. In my case, I protested by living. Perhaps that was my most important contract." He stopped, and in the absence of his voice, the traveller listened to the stream for a moment before saying, "You referred to yourself as foreign. What do you think of this town? Are you comfortable? How do your neighbours find you?" Riverton is an unusual town. Here the people are focused on life. It is a special place. I suppose that is how I have remained content here all these years. Of course, people wonder at the appearance of my land and my person, but it is accepted. Alfred's voice hardened. "I feel foreign here too, because of my past and the scars I carry. You are not from here, but you can see how it is." Alfred gestured with his hand to direct the traveller's attention across and down the lane. "Everything here is pristine. My garden is different. That was what intrigued you as you came along the lane. Just as my garden is different, so am I. I am content here because I am allowed my space. My difference and strangeness do not place me outside the parameters of this town. You might think they would, but they don't. The reason for this is that the parameters here are not strict in such a way as disallows difference. Instead, they are strict in that they disallow pettiness. I have a reason for being who I am, and that reason here is seen as valuable." What Alfred said had answered the traveller's unasked question. The people of the town distinguished between affronts. Alfred, though different, was acceptable to them. They understood him. He was a perfect example of what Michel had described. The inhabitants of Riverton were individualists, who found commonality in their respect for that personal nature that it is the duty of all men to find and embody. But it was not any individuality that was embraced. Rather, it was a very particular one, a self-governing nature not threatening to the fabric that allowed them each their space, unencumbered by external pressures. Alfred's difference, his adamance, was a statement made towards his past. They appreciated that he had stepped away from a darker place, and they related to his drive, even if they did not relate to his expression of it. Alfred continued, "I have come to be content with myself, but only after much discomfort. I decided that if I was to adopt another's thought over my own, I had better be convinced to do so. To my credit, I didn't make it easy on myself. I argued and questioned my instincts and beliefs. Thus, when I heard others' views, I was familiar with the arguments they gave, and the changes I felt I needed to make had already been made, but on the basis of my own exploration and comprehension. It has helped me to be here, where I enjoy a degree of socialization with like-minded people, but there are certain matters with which I shall never be content. I have actively watched the world all my life as an outsider, but as an outsider who has been on the inside, I simply do not agree with the course man has taken." Alfred stood upright but remained relaxed. He had put a distance between himself and the matters on which he spoke. "My family were rich but petty. Their only interest was in retaining power and influence through the control of wealth. They guarded their position with savagery that was veiled in velvet and gold, and they ruined the men who served them. But that is the nature of those who hold power. They do not use their influence to push human endeavor towards the good. Many claim to and pretend to, but usually they don't. We live in a time of great change. In recent centuries, we have seen the beginnings of a shifting of power from old institutions to new, and that shift is accelerating. Those who hold power are governed by the will to retain power and the quest for more power. I guarantee you that whatever new powers arise will be no different from the old in this respect. They will raise others to the extent that others may enrich them, and only so long as those others may never threaten them. They too will guard their wealth like dragons over hordes." Alfred thought for a moment. "I'd say the nature of man is inherently selfish. All men seek their furtherance, their individual survival, but because man is inadequate alone, or feels so after learning of the superiority of the group, he joins the group, and through that he survives. By giving himself to the group, he is saved." The traveller cut in. "Is that not to be expected?" Each does the job to which he is suited in order to survive. He serves and is served. Do you see that as a distortion? Not inherently, but within the dynamics of a large group? Of course I do. In every group are those who lead and those who follow. Everyone has joined the group because they individually believe it offers them their best chance of success. Would you not agree? The traveller said nothing, but Alfred did not require affirmation. Self-interest does not stop when people join the group, and this is where the problem arises. Those who follow are not always in a position to distinguish between the actions of their leaders that are within the interest of the group and those that are not. Do you know why? The traveller watched the man and listened. Because at first they overlap. But as time passes and the basic factors necessary to the survival of the group are increasingly secured, the leader's interests and those of the group at large begin to diverge. The followers become unable to distinguish their leader's self-interested actions, precisely because the leader's power to marshal forces of influence to his advantage is so superior. Have you not seen how, even where people see their leaders abusing their position, they do nothing? It would require the removal of a type and strength of person that they are convinced they require. Some will feel compelled towards action, but it is too often not a small step for the most inadequate to encourage all others towards inaction. The traveller asked, "By inadequacy, do you mean those who require external leadership the most?" "Yes, I do. If one person ignores, then a second may more easily do so too. Having become accustomed to following the directions of others, they have no experience to truly determine matters for themselves. This is as natural as the carpenter not making his own shoes, and the shoemaker not building his own cupboard. Leaders represent security and are encouraged to consolidate power, and with every step, they further consolidate power until their followers are incapable of doing anything to stop them, even if they wanted to. But they won't want to, because by then the leader will have convinced the people of his value. They believe he deserves what he seeks, and they give to him without question. They can no longer think for themselves. Eventually, leaders push too far, or another arises of the same kind who disrupts and usurps the leader by harnessing the very same survival instinct in the followers. He entices, same as the last, and the people follow because they must. But never do they wake up to the reality that nothing has changed. The players are different, but their type is the same, and the result is the same. The type that makes his way to power is always the same. I'm not saying there aren't variations within the type, but a man cannot reach, let alone maintain, such a position unless they embody that type. And the followers don't mind, for all they want is to survive, to maintain what they know of comfort. Alfred paused. Nothing that undermines comfort of security can be embraced. People will shy from any challenge to the design their entrusted leadership has set in place. The key word is entrusted. They must trust, because otherwise they themselves are undermined. And so, because they entrust, they lose. Where do you stand in all of this? The traveller asked. Where do you think? Man has always recognized strength, and because man seeks to be led, he naturally seeks that particular form of strength that seeks to lead. What do you do with strength that seeks neither to lead nor follow? Such strength has a capacity to do no more than pose questions no one in the leader-follower construct wants to hear. That is where I stand. I pose questions, I interrupt, and it is for that reason that I am considered awkward, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. I make life more difficult for leaders and followers alike. To answer your question, I don't stand in it. I live here instead, where the leader-follower construct has been discarded. But I am not actually unpredictable. If a person comes to know who I am, what I represent, I am utterly predictable. I represent that side of man that is nature, not belief, not imagined or invented thought, not designed by which to lead. Rather, I represent that which is so real that it may, indeed it must, naturally challenge the falsehoods that man creates. Nature and falsity cannot coexist in one space. That is why man seeks to conquer nature rather than understand it. The kind of man that seeks to lead realizes the conflict when he stands before nature. How can he abide such a challenge? He cannot. Therefore, he creates beliefs that are designed to undermine truth. It is far too easy. Alfred stopped and gazed off over the valley. It was a long time since he had spoken his mind at such length. He did not do so with those in Riverton, who had no interest, as the patterns of interactions that Alfred described had long ago been purged from their existence. Alfred also never spoke of such matters with Sarah, who, like him, had moved to the town. She was more like the people of Riverton than he, even though he had been there much longer. It was her simplicity that led her to Riverton, not her thoughts. The old man had intended that the traveller hear the thoughts of man so as to know man. So the traveller considered how solitude brings strangeness, when thoughts remove far enough from those of others that they no longer relate. Alfred had become strange, but those by whose measure he would be strange had dispensed with truth. What separated Sarah and Alfred from Kieran was that Sarah and Alfred had accepted their disappointments and adapted towards a positive growth of spirit. Kieran had never done that. He had fought disappointments and had suffered bitterness as a result. Now he lived behind walls, kept alive by the love of a woman. Only by her had Kieran left the world he had unknowingly created as a means to destroy himself. By contrast, Sarah and Alfred had also left the worlds that had been their home, but both had done so on the basis of a choice for simplicity over meanness, for a refuge from darker worlds. Riverton was an expression of the nature of its inhabitants. The consistency the town sought was in its approach to life. The appearance of Alfred's garden or of himself was of no concern when it was evident from his kindness and intelligence that he belonged there. Likewise with Sarah. Despite the painful complications of her past, her good character was evident. Riverton's interest was in its present and in its future, and not in the history of its inhabitants. From the town, the midday bells rang out, filling the broad space between the valley walls. The traveller reached out his hand and Alfred took it. They wished each other well, and the traveller continued up the lane, soon to find the path that rose up onto the hills to the north. There he would find Melior and Leolfa waiting for him. The time had come to seek the Valley of the Springs. The traveller's hands tingled as he clenched them and dipped them in the stream beside the path. He washed his face in the cool water and looked down on Riverton bridging the waters of the dale. He could see the swimmers already, their gliding bodies drawing strength from the currents that flowed from the palm of his master. Again he dipped his hands into the stream and splashed the water on his face. Points of light too fast to be watched glinted off the surface. He clenched his hands again, and water dripped to the ground, squeezed out with the pressure. The breeze cooled his wet face. He had met his wife. His life had started. Its time for travelling was soon to end.